You're listening to Autumn on the Air, the weekly podcast that brings you conversations about the impact of research commercialization and the people who make it happen. Join us for interviews with patent and licensing professionals, innovators, entrepreneurs, and tech transfer leaders on the issues and trends that matter most. Keep listening for an inside track on the people, IP policies, and politics changing our world.
Welcome, everyone, to Autumn on the Air. In today's episode, we're delving into a report from the United States Patent and Trademark Office's Office of the Chief Economist that sheds light on the pivotal role played by small companies and universities in driving COVID-19 diagnostic inventions. Joining us today are two experts, Andrew Toole and Nicholas Pairolero, who have contributed significantly to this research. Welcome, Andy and Nick. I'm so excited to have you here on the podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here,
thanks, Lisa.
Yeah, I'm very excited to have you both here, and I'm very interested in talking about your report, Diagnosing COVID-19, a perspective from U.S. patenting activity. And let's go ahead and jump in and talk right away about that report. So what sparked the decision to shine a spotlight on small companies and universities in your report?
Well, if you don't mind, Nick, I'll take this one to start off. I'm just super excited to be able to talk to your audience today about this report. We've actually been doing a lot of work on COVID-19 up to this point. And, to be quite direct to the answer to your question, is that we didn't know in advance that small companies and universities were going to play such an outsized role. But the origin of the report, I think, is very relevant for universities, and that is the World Trade Organization adopted a waiver of COVID-19 related vaccine patents back in June of 2022. And since, of course, it was related to trying to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic, and everybody, of course, at that time was trying to figure out what do we do to stop this. But subsequently, there was a suggestion to expand that waiver beyond the vaccines to therapeutics and diagnostics. And what that did is it opened up this information vacuum because nobody really knew what does that mean? How much patenting is really happening and who's doing it in this area? So that was one of our big impetus behind it, was to add some information to that policy to help support that policy decision, which will be made eventually here, about what to do. So we found just basically that the universities and small companies just really emerged as leaders in terms of patenting in COVID-19 diagnostics.
Wow, that's incredible. And how long have you been working on this report?
Well, the report itself, it happened. So to back up 1 second, the U.S. Trade Representative requested a study from the International Trade Commission. Some of these institutions may be familiar to the audience, and they were really scrambling to try and figure out what was going on. So that really was the trigger. So we started on this, probably in March or April of 2023. And what year is it? And we ended up working really fast. We had so Nick here was a tremendous part of our team, really helped to organize everybody. We had patent examiners, so we had really technically deep, knowledgeable people involved. We have ourselves, the economists, who are really more on the data side. And actually, I have to give, again, a lot of credit to Nick, who was able to orchestrate this group within the PTO and also collaborate and engage with the International Trade Commission on it as well. So I guess we started like in April or May, probably April of 2023.
Wow, you guys did work fast because we're talking it's middle of January 2024. So I'm sure it was a tremendous amount of data that you both had to go through. And given all this work that you did and how quickly you went through it, I'm curious, given the leadership by small companies and universities, are there any examples of some innovative COVID-19 diagnostic inventions from these smaller organizations and universities that stood out while you were doing your research?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Lisa. I think that's a really, really, really good question. So what we did is we took a look at the top 20 or so patent applicants in this particular area. That's COVID-19 diagnostics. And I think if you look at the top five, the top company was a small company called Detect Incorporated. You had another company, Pathogen DX, another small company. The University of Utah Research Foundation was also there. And he said, okay, well, let's kind of pull back these companies and try to figure out what was going on, what is currently going on, and can we try to figure out this sort of path from like invention to patent application to commercialization and see how that might be different across them. And, so one of those companies, Detect Incorporated, it started, I think, in like March 2020, right? So that's right when COVID-19, we said, okay, March, April, at least in the United States, we became really aware of that. It was a venture-backed company. And what happened was they were able to get what's called an FDA emergency use authorization, right? That's really a mouthful, but it's sort of this, it was a pandemic. We have this sort of fast track authorization for diagnostics. And eventually they had to sort of revoke that. So Detect revoked it, I think, early last year. And it's hard to say exactly why. It didn't say why they had it revoked in their letter to the FDA, but they did have some problems with specific lots of their tests the prior year, having too many false negatives and things. So it's hard to say exactly what happened there. But then, that's one small company maybe had a little bit of a difficulty. But then this other company, Pathogen DX, they have a current EUA, that's emergency use authorization, another small company, and they were able to sort of take their diagnostic that was meant for like fungus and bacteria and, flip that to COVID-19 right at the start of the pandemic with perhaps some help from the government, from the NIH and from NIAID as well. So that's currently in use. The test is currently commercialized. So it's sort of two different paths that kind of illustrate kind of what might be happening in this space.
Yeah, really interesting. And the speed at which all this happened was really fascinating, I think, to watch too. And I'm sure you saw that during your research. So I'm curious, could you tell me how these contributions from these various smaller organizations help to enhance the adaptability and diversity present in the COVID-19 diagnostic innovation landscape?
Yeah, so I think those are really, really key words, right? Sort of the adaptability and how sort of flexible we found the innovation ecosystem to be, right? This is sort of, we all got hit with this shock. Andy mentioned a shock. Well, this is a really big shock to the system, right? To the public health system. And when you look at when were these applications filed, they were filed immediately in March, April, and May, right? So there was like this sort of pent up or built up capacity to diagnose COVID-19 in this particular case. And we can see that in the data, about 18 months later when applications are published, we see the big spike, right? That's when we saw the most applications published about 18 months after the start of the pandemic. And I think, because such a large share were small companies, nonprofits, universities, basically, what does this allow for? Well, we just saw a couple of cases where, it can be challenging, right, to go from conception to invention to application to commercialization, right? So you want to have a lot of irons in the fire, perhaps, right? So you don't know what's going to happen because things are so rapidly changing. And then also, if you have, a lot of different tests that might translate into lower prices for consumers, that just allows us to sort of track the pandemic and help with the public health response, and also just, us taking tests to figure out if we should go to Christmas or, holiday dinner or something like that, right? It's really important to have these things available and have them be accurate.
So do you have any sense of how many filings there were in the initial part of the pandemic?
Yeah, one of our key findings shows, and I'll just say it right here, that we had a peak in filings that became public in the fourth quarter of 2021. And that, because there's an 18-month day period of time between filing and when it becomes public, that actually means that the companies were really responsive right away, April, May, and June of 2020. So, we all were sent home, or most of us were sent home
exactly.
In March, and suddenly in April, we're already getting filings. So there was a big surge. It kind of looked like a wave if you look at the graph. It just rises up and then it starts to taper off like a wave shape. And it's just fascinating how fast the response was.
Yeah, I know there were a lot of scientists and various companies that were working 24/7. So it's not surprising to me that you saw this big wave. And I'm curious, do you have some theories about the driving forces behind all these filings and the amount of filings?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to know for sure, of course. We haven't done a deep dive on all of the drivers behind what we've found. But it's certainly true that the university system was well poised to respond to the pandemic. Obviously, there were a number of different government programs and support for research that came out at that time that helped, prop up and propel the work. But I think it really has to do with the ability to switch. One thing that companies aren't necessarily able to do as much is to be as flexible as academic institutions can be in shifting the focus. Many academic researchers are very adept at doing that, actually, especially when they have to get funding from agencies like the National Institutes of Health. They're very good at switching between the different focuses. So I think that a lot of it came from the fact that the university is well poised with the human capital, the smart people, the graduate students, and the funding to really be responsive and flexible. And I think that that and the fact that we got this additional funding was probably a large part of why that was true, that we had this responsiveness by the university system, and particularly small companies.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I want to stay on this concept of government support here for a second, because entities like the NIH played a crucial role in COVID-19 diagnostics. So talk to us a little bit more about how this support translated into tangible outcomes and advancements in the field at this time.
Sure. I mean, one of the most interesting things about patenting is that you can look at two ways in which the funding from government is really fueling the innovation, particularly in the university system. So you can look at the assignee, that is to say, who owns the patent. And if you only look at the assignee among so we found 824 COVID-19 diagnostic patents starting our study in December 1st of 2019 and going through the early part of 2023, where we had to cut our data off and just start analyzing it.
That's a lot.
It was about 1 out of 3 filings related to COVID were actually COVID diagnostic related. So about 33%, which actually I was a little bit surprised that it was such a large percentage, but it's reassuring that it was. Anyway, if you just look at the assignee, the ownership, you find that only a small number, let's see here, it was just a fraction. It was, I'm looking for my number here, 15 out of that 824 were actually assigned to government. So that's a very small fraction. But what's important to recognize is it's not just the government owning the patent. It's actually more important under Bayh-Dole, which is the 1980 Bayh-Dole Act, which allows universities to get exclusive rights to inventions that are partially funded by government. And what the university and the filer must do is put a little statement into the patent application that says this was partially supported by government funding. Well, what we did is we looked for those particular statements within the application. So it's a natural language processing type search. If you do that, the number jumps from the 15 that I told you to 88. So essentially about 10.7, so rounding off to 11% of all of the patenting that we found related to COVID-19 diagnostics was supported in part by government funding. And again, I think this goes back to the funding surge, where many people would agree that we did put in a fairly substantial amounts of money to try to help offset the shock of COVID-19. But again, about 10.7 or 11% of the total number of filings were showing government support.
Oh, that's really amazing. And going back to the total number of diagnostic applications filed, I think that number is really incredible because I'm sure, as you both are well aware, diagnostic inventions have some patentability challenges in the USPTO with respect to subject matter eligibility. So it seems like filers were taking the attitude, you know what, we'll worry about that later. We're just gonna file and probably just deal with that later if and when it comes, type of thing. So that's really pretty interesting.
Yeah, and if I can mention additionally, so Nick here is he heads up our work on artificial intelligence for identifying patents and grouping them and creating studies such as patent landscapes. And so there's two approaches. There's the standard approach to figuring out if this patent is part of COVID-19, where you look at the technology field and you do a search, like a query. And then there's the AI approach, where you train a model. And so we're working on the AI approach more broadly, and we have some other stuff we could talk about in that area. Of course, it's not the subject of today's talk. But what I wanted to mention is that, and Nick can add to this, I think, when we started doing this to try to figure out which patents were actually related to COVID-19 diagnostics as opposed to therapeutics and vaccines, we had to take a couple of different approaches. And the one that I just told you about, the one in which we found 824 patent documents, that was one of our approaches. I don't know, Nick, do you want to just explain for a moment or two of what you think about that?
Yeah. So we can sort of, dive into the data a little bit. I think it's actually really, really informative once we can kind of zoom back out. But, I think people that are, doing patent searches, or you're trying to understand a technology, or you're in a technology transfer office and you want to figure out, where should we be trying to sort of connect the government and funds or whatever, right? So it's useful to go into how do you identify the technologies. And, Andy was talking about this sort of broader approach where we just looked inside the entire patent document, right? So there's a big description of it. There's a precise definition of the claims. Said, okay, well, is this generally related to COVID-19, right? That's sort of one approach. Then the second approach is said, okay, well, let's be a little bit more specific, and let's look at, there's a commercial company called Derwent, and they manually create really kind of short descriptions of what inventions actually are in patent applications. So let's just look at, what Derwent says. Now, between these two approaches, right, from the kind of smaller approach, we found, 50% more documents in the broader approach, right? So I think it was like 824, and the broader approach was 1,200 or something like that, right? So there's a big difference in which of these inventions are related to COVID-19. Then we sort of, we use classifications in Derwent to find the diagnostics, but it's really challenging. And each time we sort of do this, we sort of figure out a little bit more how to do it, perhaps better the next time. But I think in this broader approach, something like half of them that we said were COVID-19 diagnostics weren't actually COVID-19 diagnostics. They might have said COVID-19 somewhere, and maybe it was related peripherally or something like that, but it's something that this was sort of put in there strategically or for whatever reason. So, it's tough, I think, to dive into the data and identify technologies, but some of these details really, really do matter when you're trying to understand the broader innovation ecosystem.
And let me just add one more thing, if I may. Getting into the data is a really important part of being able to describe what we found. And just to mention one thing I find pretty funny is that in the broader search that Nick just mentioned, we found a patent application that was published, the title of which is Board Game Relating to COVID-19 Pandemic.
Oh my gosh, really?
So it's kind of like, I kind of imagined the game of life, right? But they had a board game with COVID-19 related issues. Maybe it was about, I didn't get to see the details.
Gosh. I'm going to have to look that one up. I mean, it's probably a very scary game if you think about it, given all that was going on at that time, And I mean, what is it? You win if you don't have COVID, your diagnostic test comes back negative. We're going to have to look and find that one. But yeah, it sounds like a tremendous amount of work that you guys both did and your team did. And, I think one of the really interesting things about research sometimes is those unexpected surprises that you run across. So, did you have some aha moments, or did you find some unexpected trends that emerged during your research? And how do you think these unexpected moments or trends might inform the strategies of university tech transfer professionals moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think there were a few aha moments. The one of the aha moments was just the discovery that actually universities and small firms were such a big part of the equation here. We honestly expected it to be the large companies. Another thing that struck me, and Nick may have a few things to add because he really was in there deep in the data. But one of the things that struck me was the Food and Drug Administration on their website lists the COVID-19 at-home tests. So you can actually see the companies, you can see the name of the test and all sorts of information. So if you start with that and you try to go back to the patents, you would think that you would find all of these different patents underlying each of these tests. In fact, that didn't work hardly at all. And I think Nick may have some war stories about that. That was a surprise, right? Why can't we find the patenting here? And one explanation could be that the large companies adjusted from their current platforms, and they really didn't have to re-protect those platforms. They just sort of tweaked them. Whereas the small companies were really innovating new platforms and new things that did require some patent protection. So that was a couple of the things that struck me.
And Nick, tell us your war stories.
Oh, the war stories. Well, before we get to that, first I just want to, really, really emphasize Andy's first point. I mean, I think the main reason why we're here is to talk about, the small companies, the universities, and nonprofits. So I think 71% of the public filings that we found were paying small and micro entity fees, right? Wow. These are the small companies. These are the universities, right? And the overall share is, I have 24% here, right? So like you take an average patent application, 24%. So it was huge, right? And if you look at the ones that Andy was talking about, the government interest, the ones that had the government interest, 81%. Right, were the small companies and the universities and the nonprofits, right? So they were kind of disproportionately receiving the funding from the government. That's your NIH, RADx, right? That's the Rapid Acceleration of Diagnostics, a program that was set up for diagnosing COVID-19, right? So it's super interesting. In terms of trying to figure out, trying to link the diagnostic products to the patented inventions, it's extremely, extremely difficult. I think there's 350 tests, right, that have the emergency use authorization, right? These are molecular, antigen, and the kind of rapid at-home tests. So there are a lot of tests, and that's kind of, reflective of all of the invention that we found here. But very, very few of the sort of product packaging had any information about, where are the patent applications coming from, where are the patented technologies. For whatever reason, that's not something that we really dug into or were able to dig into, but I mean, that was very surprising. It's just, it's very, very difficult because that's really what you want to know, right? You have inventions. Are they patented? But how do they actually show up in the products? And that's sort of a missing link, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I think it can be very difficult just under normal circumstances because I'm a patent attorney to just do that generally. So I can imagine for you guys with all those different tests and the information you're dealing with, especially the way claims are drafted, if they're extremely broad, trying to make that connection between the product and the claims can be really difficult to try and figure out what application is covering which test. So it's not surprising to me that was challenging for you guys. It's challenging for us as attorneys to do sometimes. So I wanted to ask the two of you, what do the report's findings tell us about how government support and innovation are interconnected, especially in the very important healthcare sector?
I think it's an easy answer. They're extraordinarily interconnected. Government support is one of the most important sources of fueling healthcare innovation in the United States, even globally. Our National Institutes of Health is the largest funding agency for healthcare research in the world. And it goes far beyond our simple report. And, we looked at patent data with assignees being NIH or whatever, and the government interest statements being in there saying that the companies received some support from the NIH or other agencies like the DoD, Department of Defense, for instance, was also big. But it's really all that funding that goes into the university system. And in my prior life, when I was a university professor, I wrote a paper and it got published in this journal called Research Policy, which applied kind of people care about. And and I don't want to get off the topic, but it does show the importance of NIH-funded basic research as fueling drug innovation in the pharmaceutical industry. And that's just one example, because here we're talking about diagnostics, which is a separate and fascinating industry beyond the therapeutics. But there's just no question, honestly, that how critical government funding and support is for university-based healthcare innovation, or even small companies in our economy.
Now, as part of your research, did you take a look at some of the obstacles that smaller groups, whether it was smaller organizations or universities, face while trying to secure their patents for COVID-19 diagnostic innovations?
That's also a really good question. I think, it's hard for us to say the diagnostics companies that we have in this particular data set, so in COVID-19 diagnostics, but we do have some work that looks at this kind of more broadly. So patent applications that come from, I keep saying small and micro entity applicants. Those are the small companies, universities, et cetera, right? So, there's some evidence that shows that, hey, well, they may use attorneys that have less experience, so they filed fewer patent applications in the past for whatever reasons, slightly lower allowance rates overall, and maybe these applications require more changes in the process, before they're disposed, eventually granted perhaps, or they could be abandoned. So there's some evidence there. It's sort of very correlational, right? But then there's also a very recent study by an international team of researchers that really kind of shows that the quality of the attorney matters in sort of getting through this complicated legal process that we call patent examination, and especially in technologies that are rapidly changing. So like COVID-19, it's rapidly changing, and in also areas that are kind of less codified or less precise. So, it's just a little bit of evidence, right, that shows that, hey, perhaps financial resources matter, or the quality of the attorneys matter. There might be different resources across different entity types, so large companies versus small companies, for example. But I think overall, we just kind of need to dig into that a lot more to figure out, what's going on and how can we sort of aid or assist or sort of improve the experiences of these types of applicants.
So are you going to continue on in your research? So will that be something you look ahead to going forward, or are you done on this, moving on to other projects?
If you're referring to small businesses in general, we're definitely focused on a small and micro entities is a category we label because they pay discounted fees for their filing, and they have to meet certain criteria to be called small and micro, as opposed to undiscounted entities. But we have a whole research program essentially trying to understand what's happening, not only with small and micro entities as individual units, but actually the inventors and the women versus men. So what kind of women's participation are we seeing? And one of the facts that actually, on one of the papers that Nick and I have, it shows that first-time women inventors are arriving at the PTO in a greater proportion through small and micro entities than they are through the large companies. And, so that just highlights the importance of these small and micro entities for understanding all sorts of things, and innovation and new technology versus the old Goliath, but also participation and diversity among inventors.
Yeah.
So we have a lot going on in that area.
Absolutely. And are you going to continue on with this COVID-19 type of aspect of your research, or will that have you done all that you're going to do on that, and you'll just continue on just generally with microentity and small organizations?
Well, one of the projects we have is not COVID-19 specific, but talks about economic shocks like the Great Recession and all the uncertainty that was created there, the COVID-19 pandemic and all the uncertainty that was created in the economy when that happened, and really asks the question, when applicants, universities, small companies, large companies are hit by these waves of uncertainty because of the change in the economic environment, how do they react with their patenting? And so we're pursuing this But we're pursuing it in kind of a broader sense by asking how uncertainty in these circumstances is affecting the choices of applicants rather than just looking at COVID-19.
So, Andy and Nick, I'm going to ask you guys to pull out your crystal balls for a second, and I'm going to ask you a really, really broad question. And my question is, how might the concentration of inventions in specific technologies impact the competitive landscape within the healthcare industry? And I know that's a super broad question, but I'd love to hear your thoughts.
If you don't mind, Nick, I'll take the first stab, but I think you should have the opportunity to chime in as well if you want. Well, first of all, I want to draw a very clear distinction. We have patenting and concentration in patenting, which is a technology concentration. And then we have the healthcare industry. We have patients and doctors and hospitals and nurses and all of these groups. That's products and services and people helping people. Those are two separate worlds. Now, they're not they're interconnected. They're not separate in that regard, but they are two conceptually distinct worlds. And so if we get a lot of concentration in the technology side, it doesn't mean that we're going to have like concentration in markets. So it doesn't mean that people are going to be squeezed, let's say, with higher prices or something like that. That we cannot make that connection immediately. But one of the things that I think is interesting about concentration in the technology side, in the patenting side where we are, is that people talk about the importance of being able to license different technologies to different entities. And so there's this kind of pejorative phrase called patent thickets that people use to describe areas that have a lot of patenting where it might be difficult to negotiate licenses across multiple patent holders. But what's fascinating here is some earlier work that Nick has done with some co-authors. They've actually come up with a way of measuring this kind of technological concentration. I don't think the term thickets, which has this pejorative nature, is being used. But what do you think based on that, Nick? Do you want to mention that work?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think this is one of the first things that I got my college degree, and I sort of this is the first thing that I looked at, right? And it just looked at kind of the overlap of the claims, right? So we know that, for people that are really, kind of into patents and things, we know that the patent claims, they precisely describe what the invention is. And all that we did is we looked at the overlap of the claims, right? So, this invention has 25% overlap with this invention or 50% overlap or something like that. And I think, a broad trend that sort of, popped out there is that we do see increasing overlap over time. Now, that could mean a lot of things, right? It could mean that, technology is getting sort of denser, or maybe technology is getting more complex. I think, we have this understanding perhaps that technology is becoming more complex. You think about smartphones or, these complex gadgets that we have in one particular area. A lot of different inventions fit in. But how do the inventions fit in, right? Are they all complementary? Do we have substitutable inventions that are patented? Well, substitution, that typically means an increase in competition, right? You have 10 inventions that all do the same thing. That has a particular kind of impact on how things are licensed or how they fit into products and things. So I think overall that space is very, very interesting. But in terms of, COVID-19 here, I think we sort of just said there's like 350 tests, right? So there's, in some sense, that's concentration, but it's also diversity in products, right? We have all of these different tests, and some of them end up not working very well, but some of them really do work very well, right? So it's sort of a good idea to have all these different tests, different vaccines, different therapeutics. And so I see that as sort of a really, really, robust and nice thing about the way that the innovation ecosystem responded, right? I mean, we got hit by this shock and all of these tests and all of these inventions. And I think it's just really, really, really important and really interesting. So,
can I also mention one other thing directly from the report? So in the report, we actually have a figure that identifies the top 10 cooperative patent classification subclasses. That's the way the Patent Office groups technologies. And it's quite amazing that we had nearly 50% of the patents that we identified for COVID-19 were in a class labeled G01N for all of you people who love that. But it's actually called Analyzing Materials by Chemical and Physical Properties. And that was the largest technology class where these COVID-19 diagnostic patents appeared. The second largest class, so again, we have a list of 10 of them, and I urge people to go look because it's really fascinating. We also have a couple, we actually have 3 examples in the report that really describe the kind of interconnectedness of the technologies. So they're not really these separate, distinct things, but they are kind of grouped that way. Anyway, the second largest was measuring enzymes, nucleic acids, and microorganisms. So you get to see these very interesting groupings by technology for the overall set of patents that we called COVID-19 diagnostics.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And so I don't want you guys to put away your crystal balls quite yet, because I want to ask you a forward-looking question. And so looking ahead, considering the lessons from the COVID-19 pandemic, what collaborative roles do you envision for smaller organizations such as universities? And how might government support play a crucial role in addressing future health crises?
So, I think, I don't do work specifically in the area. Andy has a much stronger background in sort of the relationship between the government and funding and invention and that kind of thing. But I'll just say, the things that popped out to me, like when I was looking at the companies, right, like Pathogen DX, right, there was this new program by the NIH called RADx, which they were funding, kind of small companies, diagnostics for COVID-19, commercialization, basically what it seemed like was the sort of entire pipeline, right? So that program, perhaps other new programs that were kind of, just put into place because we didn't know what to do. And it was this giant shock. Now is the time to sort of go back and evaluate how well these programs perform, because, it may not be COVID-19 next time. It could be really anything that happens, right, that sort of shocks the system. And it's a good idea to sort of have a good idea of kind of what works, what doesn't work, and that kind of thing. So, it probably won't be me to sort of dig into all of these nuances. I'm not, a specialist in that area, but I'm interested in kind of learning what others sort of come up with and identifying all of these programs that were put into place and how well they performed.
Yeah, so I would like to add to what Nick has said by just kind of backing up a little bit into the broader picture here. And I had the benefit of working with the Chief Economist of the European Patent Office, the Chief Economist of the World Intellectual Property Organization, WIPO, and an academic researcher, Reinhilde Vugelis, who's at the KU Leuven in Belgium. And we were co-editors of a book entitled Resilience and Ingenuity, Global Innovation Responses to COVID-19, which is free. And I'll tell you about it in just a second. But if you just go to Google and type in resilience and ingenuity and you press it, you'll find it. It's a free downloadable book. But what's interesting in that book is we have an overview chapter, and we have all of these different perspectives from around the world. And a couple of these contributions really highlight the importance of the collaboration that has to happen between government and organizations. So, for instance, there's a chapter that Reinhilde wrote on mRNA, new breakthrough technology, and how universities played such an important role in that particular therapeutic approach to COVID-19. And the overall lesson of that was that when you look across the world, we see the most impactful and kind of like bang for the buck kind of outcomes when the government and the private sector really join hands and work in a collaborative way. So that just the word collaboration can mean many things, but that is in many varieties. There's public-private partnerships and so on, but that is a great word, and it really does highlight the critical aspect of how we need to respond going forward. If there is going to be another pandemic of some kind, the responsiveness that we have as the United States and other countries have is going to depend a lot on this collaboration between, universities, small companies, large companies, and the government, right? We're all in it together.
Exactly. And that's one thing COVID-19 showed us. We're all in it together. There was definitely no escaping it. So But thank you both so much for your time today and your expertise, and congratulations on the report. It's really incredible, and I encourage listeners to give it a read.
Thank you so much, Lisa. It was a lot of fun, and the report's on our website, USPTO Economics, completely free, and enjoy.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. I really appreciate it.
Thank you both. Well, that's it for this episode. A big thanks to our guests, Andy and Nick, for sharing valuable insights on COVID-19 diagnostics from the USPTO's report, Diagnosing COVID-19, a perspective from U.S. patenting activity. For more insights, be sure to check out the full report on the USPTO's website, or you can find it in this episode's show notes.
Thanks for listening to Autumn on the Air with Lisa Mueller. Get social with us and share your thoughts. You can tweet us at AUTM or visit us online at AUTM.net. We'll be back next week on the air. Be sure to join us.